Everybody have the notes this morning? So these are two videos that I think are important, but one is very short. It's only 9 minutes. The other one's 18 minutes. So together they should be about 30 minutes here. The first one is on Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal, and that goes along with our last lesson of what we learned about the stone of witness in Shechem. And so you remember Mount Gerizim to the south, Mount Ebal to the north. And we have those scriptures there, Joshua chapter 8 and Deuteronomy chapter 27. But that's for your reference. And that altar's still there, as you see there in the photograph. He's going to be looking at that. This is, of course, on Mount Ebal, just north of the modern town of Nablus, the ancient town of Shechem. The second video is on the Moabite stone, which is very interesting. Again, we live in an age of skepticism, and if the Bible basically says it, then secularists they will just deny it. And yet we have in archaeology and in history, the Moabite stone goes back to 840 before Christ, and it mentions Jehovah, and it also mentions Omri as king of Israel during the time of the divided kingdom. And so these are external witnesses to what the history of the Bible. It's just another one of those evidences which is really important. It's quite an interesting story about the stone of the Moabite stone. So we'll be looking at those videos.
Ancient Shechem, and I'm going to try to get to the altar site that was excavated up on Mount Ebal. I'm going to enter Nablus into Area A, which means that it's under the military, the Palestinian military and police. I want to get up there before I get kicked out of here. Okay, just a truck. So the altar, I don't know if you can see it, but it's up to my left here. Here it is. Wow.
This is Mount Ebal. In the Bible, Joshua 8:30 says, "Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord." In the 1980s, Israeli archaeologist Adam Zertal discovered and excavated a stone altar on Mount Ebal and identified it as Joshua's altar. Mount Ebal is located north of the Dead Sea and about 30 miles north of Jerusalem in the West Bank of Israel. South of Mount Ebal is Mount Gerizim, and between them the biblical city of Shechem. This is what the region looks like today. The ruins of Shechem are in the Palestinian city of Nablus, between Mount Gerizim to the south and Mount Ebal to the north. Just to the north of Shechem, Mount Ebal rises to 3,805 feet above sea level, and located on the eastern side of the mountain, a considerable distance to the north of Shechem, is the stone altar Zertal excavated. This altar was discovered by Adam Zertal from the University of Haifa. He was doing a survey in this area, and in 1980 he found this structure, and from 1982 to 1984 he excavated it and ended up interpreting it as not only an altar, but the altar that is talked about in Deuteronomy and Joshua, that Joshua built and the Israelites here on Mount Ebal. Now, Zertal's interpretation was met by a bunch of skepticism. So recently a curse tablet was discovered that comes from Zertal's excavation site. And so this has brought the debate back to the surface. And so the arguments are swirling around again. There's many arguments that are posed against this altar being Joshua's altar, but one of the main ones is its location. What I want to do for this video is focus on the location of this altar. Is there anything in the Bible that would contradict its location or disqualify Zertal's interpretation that this is Joshua's altar? Or is there good reasons for why the Israelites may have chosen this as the site and location for the altar? Now, the wrong location argument is that the altar that Zertal found is not located close to the important biblical city of Shechem. It doesn't overlook Shechem. It's located a couple miles further to the north on a slope of Mount Ebal. And indeed, it's true that when you are at Zertal's excavation area where the altar is, you can't see the ruins of Shechem because it's located a couple miles further south. So therefore, it's pretty simple. The Bible says that Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal, and Dr. Zertal discovered and excavated a stone altar on Mount Ebal. There is nothing in the Bible that is more specific. It's very general. There's nothing that specifies where the altar was built on the mountain. So there's nothing in the Bible that contradicts or disqualifies Zertal's interpretation that the altar that he discovered and excavated is the altar of Joshua. Really, when you're thinking of an orientation of worship towards Shechem, there really isn't an ideal place on Mount Ebal for this to happen. Even if you're on the summit of the mountain, the highest place, you still can't from there see the ruins of Shechem because the slopes of Mount Ebal towards the south are very gradual until they finally drop off towards the city. So really the only place that you're overlooking Shechem is on these steep slopes, and this would not be ideal to gather a large multitude of Israelite worshipers. Somebody chose this location for an altar. Why did they choose this location? Well, obviously it is oriented towards the east. We know this because Zertal's team uncovered the ramp on the western side of the altar. If a priest is ascending the altar on the ramp and offering sacrifices, then he is facing the east. So there's nothing in the Bible that mandates that the orientation of the altar on Mount Ebal should be towards Shechem. There is information in the Bible that gives the sacred direction as being east. It says in Exodus 27:13 that the courtyard is to be on the east end toward the sunrise. And of course, the altar is in the courtyard. So the altar is on the east side of the temple. So it makes biblical sense that the altar on Mount Ebal would be on the east side of the mountain, oriented in the direction of east where the sun rises. And when you're thinking of an eastern orientation, then the location of the altar that Zertal found is ideal. And this is because there is a natural shelf or bench, and the altar itself is on the eastern side of that. So you have this flat area, and then you have the western slopes of the mountain. If you're looking at it, it's like a theater where a multitude of Israelite worshipers could gather, and all of them would be facing the sacrificial altar as well as the direction of east. So after the ceremony on Mount Ebal, the Israelites go down to Shechem and renew the covenant. And we're told about this in Deuteronomy 27:11, which gives the instructions that 6 tribes shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people, and the other 6 tribes shall stand on Mount Ebal to pronounce curses. Mount Ebal is the mountain of curses. That's why Joshua didn't build the altar on Mount Gerizim. You don't need an altar of sacrifice on the Mount of Blessings. You need it on the mountain of curses. Joshua 8:30 says that Joshua built the altar on top of Mount Ebal. And then a few verses later in verse 32, it says, Joshua wrote on stones a copy of the law of Moses. There was a copy of the law at the altar on the Mount of Curses. Can you imagine that when the plaster was still intact, the law of the Lord was at this place? So this foreshadowing event helps us understand our own reality. In Galatians 3:10 it says, "For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. As it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law." We are on the Mount of Curses. We don't need an altar of sacrifice somewhere else. We need it where we are. And this is why a few verses later in verse 13 it says, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. Jesus came down out of heaven, the place of blessing, to the earth, which is the place of cursing, to offer himself as a sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins, so that we would not receive the curses that we do deserve, but instead we would receive the blessings that we don't deserve. So there's nothing in the Bible that contradicts the location of the altar that Zertal found as being the altar of Joshua. There's nothing that would disqualify this interpretation. And in fact, there's good reason for why the Israelites may have chosen this location for the altar, because they were orienting their worship towards the sacred biblical direction of east, towards the sunrise. So there's many other issues that also have to do with this altar that I hope to cover in future videos. So I encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. This helps us to get noticed and promoted by YouTube. And thank you for watching.
Okay, gotta go to the next video now. Yeah. So actually, he didn't really bring it out very much, but they found at that altar site an Egyptian scarab that dates to the time of the Exodus. And of course, you remember that the Israelites spoiled the Egyptians. They took many of their precious things, jewels and so on with them. And they found like a medallion right there at that altar site. Also, he just introduced the subject that they found these tablets that have the curses written on them. And they actually found one of these tablets that had, because Mount Ebal is where they pronounced the curses, and they found one of these clay tablets that had some of the curses that we find there in Deuteronomy chapter 27 right at that site. And so it's kind of amazing that they have found that. So the next one is about the Moabite stone, and I think you'll find this really interesting as well.
So we are heading down from Ammon to the town of Dibon, and this preserves the biblical name Dibon.
Anybody blamed my camera work, I blame Jordanian roads.
Yeah. Many of the most significant archaeological discoveries were not found by archaeologists, and where we're going and what was found there is no exception to that. It was actually found by a Protestant missionary by the name of Frederick Klein. I'm standing on the mound of ruins of the city that the Bible calls Dibon. This is the ancient capital of the Moabites. So in the 1800s, there was many skeptics that began arguing that the Bible was not historical. And during this same time, in these ruins, there was an archaeological discovery that was made. An article appeared in the newspaper called the Pall Mall Gazette on Wednesday, April 20, 1870, announcing to the public the discovery of the Moabite stone. In 1878, the Reverend James King published a book about the discovery. He wrote that it happened at a time when skeptics undertake to scoff at the Bible and to assault the stronghold of faith. At this opportune moment, he wrote, the stone of Moab rises from the tomb of antiquity and cheers the faithful and gives strength to the wavering. This is the story of that discovery and the impact that it had. For those interested, I'll leave a link in the description where you can order a copy of my book, which is #1 in archaeology. Dibon is located east of the Dead Sea, on a high plateau, just to the north of the deep Arnon River Gorge, today called Wadi Mujib, and next to the important ancient route called the King's Highway. The red arrow shows the rotation of the camera in the next panoramic shot. This is the Arnon River Canyon to the south. And this is the ancient mound of ruins of Dibon. Next to it is the town of Dibon, which preserves the older biblical name Dibon. To the east is the King's Highway, still in use today. Dibon sits on a plateau where to the west is the Dead Sea. In 1868, the Reverend Frederick A. Klein, who was a native of Prussia and an Anglican church missionary, was living in Jerusalem, but made an expedition on the eastern side of the Jordan. Klein wrote a letter dated Jerusalem, March 23, 1870, where he gives his personal account of this wonderful discovery.
So on August 19th, 1868, he came into this area, and there was an encampment here of Bedouin. And so, as was the custom, he went into the tent of the sheikh and was served coffee. And while he was drinking this coffee, the sheikh told him that in the ruins that was less than a 10-minute walk away from this encampment, there was a stone with an inscription on it that had never been seen by a European. So Klein was taken somewhere up here on the Acropolis of the site, and he was shown this huge granite slab with an inscription facing the sky. And this was a pivotal moment because how he responded to seeing this inscription was going to communicate to the Bedouin around him how valuable this stone was. And so he could have acted like it was no big deal. Oh, just another inscription. You've seen one inscription, you've seen them all. Show me something interesting, and walked off. But he didn't know if he would ever see this inscription or if anybody would ever see this inscription again. So I think he did what he had to do. He made a sketch of the stone and inscription. He wrote a copy of the letters from the script of the inscription. He couldn't move the stone. It was huge. It was too heavy. And so all that he could do was take his sketch and his notes and take those back to Jerusalem with him. So after Klein left here, the Bedouin realized that they had something valuable here because Klein got quite excited about it. And so they sent their own riders out to Jerusalem to announce that, that there was this stone with an inscription, because that's what they do around here. They wanted to have a bartering war go on. And so as word got out in Jerusalem, the different agents from the different countries started trying to purchase this inscription for their national museums. And so the German museum in Berlin was interested, and Klein was trying to secure the purchase of the stone for there. Charles Warren was in Jerusalem, and the British Museum was interested. And the Louvre in Paris was also interested. The French agent, his name was Charles Clermont Guénot. And the thing about him is he was a linguist, and so he really wanted to do a translation of this inscription, and he probably more than anyone else really understood the value of this inscription, and he was determined at all cost to get this inscription. Guénot wanted this inscription so bad that he sent 3 Arabs over from Jerusalem to Dibon to make a squeeze of the inscription. Now, a squeeze, think of paper mache being laid wet over the top of the inscription and then allowed to dry. And then once it's dry, then it's peeled off and it leaves an impression of the inscription in the paper. And so these Arabs came, they obtained permission initially from the Bedouin to make this squeeze, and they went, they put the paper over the inscription, and they were waiting for it to dry when the Bedouins started fighting. A fight broke out and they were attacked. One of them was stabbed in his leg from the lance of a Bedouin. And so you can go and look at the pictures from the 1800s, and you can see the lances and what they looked like that the Bedouin were using. He was stabbed. One of his companions grabbed the paper and ripped it from the inscription. It was still wet, and jumped onto his horse and galloped off to Jerusalem, and his companions were able to join him. And so this is the way that a squeeze, it was damaged, but it was a squeeze, got to Guénot in Jerusalem. After the squeeze was made, then the Bedouin really knew that this was valuable, and so the bartering went on, and different groups tried to purchase the stone. Eventually, this is the Ottoman period, and so the Turkish government got involved. The Turkish government said, you got to turn it over. And the Bedouin hated the Turks, and they said to themselves, well, we'd rather destroy it than turn it over to the Turks. And this is when catastrophe struck. So then somewhere right around here, the Bedouin decided to do the unthinkable. They built a fire underneath the Moabite stone until it was heated up, and then they poured water on it, and this splintered it into different pieces, and those pieces were then distributed amongst the families of the tribe. When news of this got back to Jerusalem, everyone was devastated, none more so than Geno, and yet he was absolutely determined to get this inscription. So this started this long process for which he and others that were helping him were purchasing portions, pieces of this shattered inscription, and he was piecing them back together. If he couldn't get the piece itself, then he'd get a squeeze of it. And so using squeezes and these retrieved pieces of the inscription, the Moabite stone was pieced back together again.
Since 1873, the Moabite stone has been on display in the Louvre Museum. So my son Barry and I traveled to Paris to see it. This is the Moabite display in the Louvre, while this is the Mona Lisa. But at least there were a few of us excited about Mesha's inscription.
So finally, I get to see for the first time the Moabite stone itself. I've been wanting to see this for many, many years, and here it is. Wow. Now you can see the parts here. These are the original fragments that were retrieved. And then the smoother area here, that is from, that's the inscription that we know from the squeeze that was made.
Pretty cool.
So this inscription dates to the 9th century BC. Stele from the Greek, or you can say stella from the Latin. It begins by saying, I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, king of Moab. So in 2 Kings 3:4, we have Mesha, king of Moab, mentioned by name and title. And then the Mesha inscription cries out, I am Mesha, king of Moab. I mean, how incredible is that? That we have this king of Moab mentioned by name in the Bible, and then we have the actual words of Mesha that were written on this inscription coming from that time period. And then it talks about the oppression of Israel by Omri, king of Israel. And so it mentions Omri, king of Israel by name, and of course we have Omri in the Bible. It talks about his son, which we know is Ahab. And then the Bible says that after the death of Ahab is when Mesha rebels against Israel. And so this is a typical victory stele, where he is bragging about the battles that he has won over Israel and the places that he has built up. So one of the victories that Mesha wins is against Ataroth. And so Ataroth is mentioned specifically on here as one of the cities that Mesha conquers from Israel.
North of Dibon is the mound of ruins of Ataroth.
So now we're heading north from Dibon to Ataroth. There are actually at least 12 names that are found in the Bible that are also found in the Mesha inscription. Ataroth is one of them. So I'm standing in the ruins of Ataroth. Mesha and his army are conquering from Dibon to the north. Mesha in his inscription says specifically that he attacked and destroyed this city. He killed all the people in this city as an offering to his god Chemosh. And so the question then is, who was it that Mesha was attacking? Well, it was Israel that was living here. Now this happens all the way back in the book of Numbers that we read about. When Israel is coming in from its wilderness wandering, this is about 1400 BC. They're on their way to the Promised Land. At that time, this land is occupied by the Amorites. And so the Israelites attack them and conquer this land from Sihon, king of the Amorites, and then they occupy this place. For example, in Numbers chapter 32, verse 34, it says the Gadites built up Dibon and Ataroth. Now, isn't this interesting? Because then when we go forward in history over 500 years, we come to the time of Mesha and his inscription. And he says of this city, the men of Gad dwelled in the country of Ataroth from ancient times. He says ancient times because they had been dwelling here for over 500 years, according to the biblical account. So these are the ruins in the entrance of a temple. And then at the front of the temple here, we have a sacred stone, a standing stone. The archaeology of the excavation of this is really interesting. This was in use during the Israelite period when the Gadites occupied this site. They were using it for an illegitimate worship of Yahweh. First of all, it wasn't legitimate because there was no legitimate place to worship Yahweh except in Jerusalem. It was also illegitimate because of the priesthood that was taken from all sorts of people and not descendants of Levi. And so we have the archaeology here. We have Israelite worship going on here, idolatry that is described in many places in the Bible. It's what Israel was being judged for. Then the destruction by Mesha, and then the reuse of this temple to worship the Moabite god Chemosh. And so we have here this amazing correlation between the biblical record and the Mesha inscription that tells us that this city and this area was occupied not only by the Israelites, but specifically by one of the 12 tribes, the tribe of Gad.
In his inscription, Mesha also describes attacking the town of Nebo, located north of Ataroth.
And behind me here are the ruins of the town of Nebo. And so Mesha talks about attacking this city. Now, not too far away from here is Pisgah, where Moses was at when he looked out over the Promised Land and where he died. That's a different place. This is the actual city of Nebo. This is where Mesha says, Chemosh spoke to him and said, "Go take Nebo from Israel." And so under the cover of darkness at nighttime, Mesha and his army came up and laid siege to the city. He says that he fought with this city from the break of dawn until noon, and then he captured it. He killed the 7,000 inhabitants. He specifically says they were men and boys and women and girls.
In line 18 of the inscription, Mesha mentions the name of Israel's God, spelled with 4 letters from right to left, Yod-He-Waw-He, Yahweh.
And then he says something very interesting. He says that he took, and there's a word missing in the inscription, but it's believed to be vessels, meaning war trophies. He says that he took the vessels of Yahweh and dragged them before Chemosh. And so we have the earliest inscription in the Mesha stele that mentions both the name Israel and the name of the God of Israel, Yahweh, together in the same inscription.
With the aid of another inscription that was discovered more recently, and new technology, a previously missing letter on the Moabite stone inscription has been restored. Line 31 now includes the mention of the House of David, where Mesha is boasting about his southern campaign.
So most archaeology are these walls and pots and pans and bones and dust. These are mute evidence. What is the most valuable thing that you can find in an excavation are inscriptions. So the Mesha stele is one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. In the Bible we have the Israelite record, and in Mesha's inscription we have a portion of the Moabite record, and they agree in all of these details. They give us the same names of kings, the same names of nations and their gods. It gives us the names of all these cities, and it talks about the same event. Now, the argument that the skeptics were using in the 1800s and that are still around today is that the Bible was written later in history. Well, if it was written later in history, then how did it get all of these details correct that happened centuries before that? The answer is simple. The Bible is historical, and that's how it gets the details right. And so that's why this inscription continues to be so important today. Some people say you know, on the comments, well, why are you covering these discoveries that were made all the way back in the 1800s? And the reason why is because a lot of people don't know about them. And we need to know about these amazing finds that speak to the credibility and reliability of the Bible. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'll leave a link where you can order my book in the description.
Okay. Well, again, when we started this study, we compared, for example, the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon talks about cities and places and people that have never been found anywhere in the Americas. But when you compare that with real truth, the Bible is truth, and we find all these different cities and kings that the Bible speaks about. So therefore, it helps us to understand the Bible is absolutely historical and accurate. It is what it claims to be.